Did you know that Syrahs or Syrah was the most planted red wine cultivar in South Africa between 2000 and 2010? It also happened to be the most planted red cultivar in South Africa in 2022. And as I've mentioned elsewhere, it is currently vying with Cabernet Sauvignon in order to be the most planted red cultivar in the country. And it's not just in South Africa that Syrah is having a bit of a purple patch, because at the time of the last meaningful global census on wine grape plantings performed by the OIV in 2017, Syrah was the 6th most planted red cultivar in the world, and it was dramatically increasing its planting, especially in New World countries like Chile, Australia, the United States, and South Africa. We're talking Syrah because today's hand drink solar wine of the day is the Torero and Pasiphae Syrah 2022, produced by the Rueda Wine Company in consultation with winemaker Angus Paul. It's produced with fruit from the Karabib farm in one of the higher lying areas of Stellenbosch's Polkadraai Hills ward. Torero Wines is the brainchild of wine entrepreneur Fernando Rueda. His larger holding company, the Rueda Wine Company, operates as an importer for some really incredible wines from regions like Champagne, Burgundy, Barolo, Rioja, and even Melance in Switzerland. The Rueda Wine Company also operates one of the very few private cellaring facilities in the Western Cape, and Fernando also makes a few of his own wines, not least of all the Torero Suit of Lights Carignan and this Torero and Pasiphae Syrah. If you're curious about the name Pasiphae, well, according to Greek mythology, she was the queen of Crete. More interestingly, she was the daughter of Helios, the Greek god. Even more interestingly, Pasiphae seemed to have a kind of adult nighttime penchant for bulls. And after one fateful evening where she happened to hook up with a particularly beefy individual, she conceived and later gave birth to the Minotaur. As we know, the Minotaur ended up trapped in a maze that was built by Daedalus, who was of course the father of Icarus, who of course took a fateful swim after flying too close to the sun. We're not exactly sure how a torero, which means bullfighter, is ever going to get along with Pasiphae, the mother of a kind of bull. But what we do know is that Theseus, who was also the founder of Athens and a torero himself, eventually ended up killing the Minotaur and freeing child slaves from the maze in which he had been trapped. No matter which way you look at it, there seems to be a fair amount of conflict baked into this wine. Now, when we get into the glass, this theme of conflict plays itself out quite beautifully. And when you give it a sniff, I think you will see exactly what I mean. Because there's just such beautiful contrast between sweetness and savory and herbs and spices. There are just so many different categories to talk about on the nose. Those savory and herbal elements present themselves first in the form of freshly cut black olive flesh, and then also some spicy rocket leaf, and also really pungent tomato leaf along with it. But then these really pretty elements start to emerge as well, and you have floral violet and lavender elements, and these lean up against some quite distinct candied fruit, sort of raspberry sherbet and cherry candy. There's also fresher wild blackberries, and all of that is kind of garnished with a touch of delicious clove spice and even some white pepper. Now, if you thought the nose was vivid, when you give it a sip, it gets even more so. I mean, the sensory banter between the herbs and the flowers and the fruit and the spice is really quite insane. And even on the palate, each little element is so meticulously laid out in what I think is one of the more spectacular examples of what a South African Syrah can be. So while it was 100% whole bunch, it was about 80% whole berry. Obviously 20% of the berries would have been crushed to get that juice out. But that 80% whole berry is going to give you those lovely candied semi-carbonic maceration notes that you get. And that explains why we get blackberry fruit pastel and some of those sort of raspberry and cherry candy elements we mentioned earlier. So you have the grape stems adding a grippy herbal tannin and that spicy rocket leaf element from the whole bunch fermentation, and then you have the lovely pretty candied elements coming from the whole berry fermentation. And even the texture of the wine seems to have contrast or conflict baked into it, because you have a really lovely creamy element on the palate, and that's because all of the wine went fully through malolactic conversion. But that is set up against those delightfully youthful, grippy herbal tannins that come from the whole bunches that we spoke about. There really is so much to say, and that's before I've even begun to talk about the place that this wine comes from. It's worth noting that the first time I tasted this wine, I really wasn't focusing too much on where the wine was coming from. And yet, when I took that first sniff, I was transported on almost a psychedelic journey through to the birthplace of wines like Jan Smith's Damascene Syrah from Stellenbosch or Rhiannon Borman's Sons of Sugarland Syrah. So you can imagine my delight when I was informed that this wine actually does come from said birthplace of those incredible wines. The fruit is harvested from a farm called Karibib, which is in the Polkadraai hills in Stellenbosch, and it's farmed by a man called Joshua Joubert. Now, Joshua has managed to garner an almost cult-like following, and he has some of South Africa's best winemakers lining up and heavily investing in his land so that they can grow Syrah on that slope. So he has guys like Jan Smith from Damascene planting Syrah Vineyaards. He has Duncan Savage investing hugely in Eshela or Stokbay vineyards. And of course, Rhiannon Borman produces his Sons of Sugarland Syrah from the same little plot of land. Now, those winemakers that I just mentioned are, in my opinion, some of the most exciting winemakers that South Africa has right now. And without being dramatic, I'd like to suggest that if we took this Torero and Pasiphae Syrah and put it into a blind tasting with Damascene Stellenbosch Syrah and the Sons of Sugarland, I think this particular wine would hold its own beautifully. So that's all we have time for today. But if you have any questions about the Polkadraai Hills or about Fernando Rueda, then drop them into the website and I will get back to you. And if you enjoyed this video, then support us on Patreon to help us make more of these sorts of videos. And subscribe to the Hand Drink Solo YouTube channel, where we publish 6 videos every month on things like wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars, and some of the rising winemaking stars that are coming out of the dynamic South African winelands.